Sorry for the brief interruption, but fortunately, that was sort of a good place to take a break as we move from section one and to section two, where we're attempting to answer the essential question: how did European thought provide the theoretical foundations of American government? It's a really, really complicated question, and just like the first section, I'm giving you a very brief overview. But it is important to understand, and in particular, to understand what became known as the social contract theory. Now, American government in general and the American political system is a result of philosophy like the social contract theory, religious tradition like what we talked about in the previous section, trial and error, compromise, and even luck. And those are all things we'll talk about over the course of this year. But the social contract theory itself, well, what is a social contract? And that's before you can have a theory. You have to kind of understand the basis of it. It's an agreement between the people and their government, signifying their consent to be governed. An example of that would be the Mayflower Compact, a document that was written by the Puritans and other passengers on the ship on the Mayflower as it arrived before getting off the ship, enumerating the scope of their government and the expectations of the citizens. This is sort of based on that social contract theory, but the theory itself was proposed in part by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. They overlapped, and they were both influenced in some degree by the English Civil War, but they had very different views on humanity, and that sort of guided their philosophies. So, social contract theory defined is the belief that people are free and equal by natural right, and that this in turn requires all people to give their consent to be governed, or whatever that word I have there is. Hobbes, influenced by the English Civil War, as I said before, maybe more strongly than the younger Locke, wrote a treatise known as Leviathan, and you can see that mythical sea creature in the bottom right-hand part of your screen, and believed that in that he wrote that humanity's natural state was one of war, one of chaos, that government, particularly monarchy, was single leader rule, was necessary to restrain the bestial tendencies, to avoid a life in a state of nature. In other words, the state of nature, a life without written or enforceable rules, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, people are bad. To control the state of nature, government had to significantly intrude on people's rights and liberties. A single ruler, no matter how evil, was needed to guarantee the rights of the weak against the strong. If you had a democracy, it might not work in the eyes of Hobbes because there's the possibility that the majority view, the strong, would oppress the minority view, the weak. Whereas if you had a single ruler, he would be possibly oppressive to any one individual, but not as likely to be oppressive in the way that a large group of people might be to a small group of people. Locke, on the other hand, took the basic survival of humanity for granted. He argued that government's major responsibility was the preservation of private property. Writing in his two famous treatises, Locke denied the divine right of kings and argued that individuals were born equal, even kings, and with natural rights, and that kings, with that in mind, had no right to void those natural rights. The consent of the governed is the only true basis of a sovereign's right to rule. So, in other words, whereas Hobbes, in an effort to secure survival, might have accepted the rule of the monarch, Locke believed that the rule of the monarch was illegitimate without the consent of the governed from the beginning. The people form government to preserve the right of making laws with penalties, for the regulating and preservation of property, and of employing the force of community in the execution of such laws. All this only for the public good. In other words, If the government acts improperly, they break their contract and therefore lose their consent to be governed. And at this point, you can see where how Locke was very influential in the American separation from Great Britain. Power comes from the law, so lawmaking branch should be the most powerful branch, and this heavily influences the U.S. Constitution. You can pause here to take a look at the differences and similarities between the two in a format that might be easier to understand for you. Montesquieu, another government philosopher, another political philosopher, suggested that the best form of government is one that fits the particular character of its people. So in one part of the world, one form of government might be superior to another. But his theory on liberty was the one that most influenced American government. It was that power was best when divided into distinct branches that provided a system of to check power with power. In other words, checks and balances, something you probably remember from previous classes. Devising a national government in the American colonies, Americans rejected and were fearful of the British system, monarchy, aristocracy, and upon declaring independence, viewed the formation of a republican form of government more in line with its values. Sounds somewhat like Montesquieu. The framers wanted a system that placed people in the center of power. Direct democracy was unworkable because of the size of the new nation. Direct democracy is a system of government in which members of the polity meet to discuss all policy decisions and then agree to abide by majority rule. As colonies grew in size, many began to adopt what's known as indirect democracy instead of direct democracy because direct democracy had become unruly. Indirect democracy is a system of government that gives citizens the opportunity to vote for representatives who work on their behalf. The Greeks thought it was undemocratic because they believed all should have a direct say. Rousseau argued that true democracy was impossible unless all citizens participated, but this became the dominant style of government in the colonies because of the vast size of those colonies. There are a number of different kinds of government, and they were defined as early as ancient Greece by the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, as they attempted to categorize it by who participated, who governed, and how much authority those who governed enjoyed. Here's their classifications. Rule by one in the public interest was a monarchy, a king or a queen. In the self-interest, rule by one was tyranny, like a dictatorship or a totalitarian government. Rule by a few in the public interest was an aristocracy, a nobility. Ruled by a few in the self-interest was an oligarchy. For instance, South Africa during apartheid. Ruled by many for the public interest was a polity, and ruled by many for self-interest was a democracy. A monarchy in general is a form of government in which power is vested in hereditary kings and queens who govern in the interest of all. An aristocracy is a government by few in service of the many. Totalitarianism is a form of government in which power resides in a leader who rules according to self-interest and without regard for individual rights and liberties. In other words, rule by tyranny, rule for the benefit of oneself. For instance, North Korea. The leader exercises unlimited power and individuals have no personal rights or liberties. An oligarchy is a form in which the right to participate is conditioned on the possession of wealth, social status, military position, or achievement. For instance, rule by a few in their own interests, i.e., South Africa during apartheid. If you don't know what apartheid is, you should look into that after the video. A democracy, again, is a system of government that gives power to the people, whether directly or through elected representatives. And that's it for Chapter 1, Section 2. At this point, you should be able to answer, based on watching this video and the first video, the two essential questions that are also posted to Google Classroom. And you should fill out the Google form, which asks you to evaluate your understanding of those two questions.